Who struggles with high altitude baking? I've got the secret, folks, for world famous chocolate chip cookies, all adapted for high altitude. I'm Susie Felton. Welcome to Mrs. Montana Rancher. Now, I've lived at high altitude almost 8 years now, and it is a whole different ball game as I cook for this ranch crew on a day-to-day basis. Some things just have to be adapted. One of them is your cookie recipes. I've got this figured out. I've adapted the world famous chocolate chip cookie recipe that everybody uses. It's decadent, it's wonderful, and it doesn't turn out quite the same at high altitude unless you make a few little tweaks, and we're going to share those with you today. So I'm a ranch wife, a mom, an educator, and an entrepreneur, and together with my Montana Rancher, we raise cattle, kids, and crops here in Big Sky Country, which also happens to be over 5,000 feet. And I feed the ranch crew daily. It's a struggle day in and day out. And with some holidays coming up in the next couple weeks, I thought I would make some chocolate chip cookies, freeze them when nobody's home because the kids are in school today, half day, and get those in the freezer. And then I have access to some easy snacks and treats as we go into a holiday week next week and then weekend coming up. So let's get started. There's some secret sauce to making any cookie recipe at high altitude, and I'll share that with you when we get to that point. But we are going to start with a general 1 cup of butter. Now, you're supposed to soften this, but do I ever have my act together enough to soften it? No. So I melted it earlier and let it cool off. One of the things that we're going to do with these cookies is cool them off as we before we put them in the oven. And I've got it set in the oven that the timer's going to go off while we're on camera, so I'll grab those as we make this next batch. 1 cup of butter. Had I had my act together, I would have put it on the counter this morning so it was all soft, but you know, it didn't happen. I did get my kids to school on time, which was an accomplishment, but getting butter softened and having this plan in place. So instead I'm making some treats. So I've got 1 cup of butter softened. I didn't have my act together, so I melted mine on the stove, but we're gonna solve that issue as we continue to make our cookies, and I'll show you the secret sauce for high altitude chocolate chip cookies. So we'll do that. We're going to cream I want to make sure we're getting this right. I'm following the recipe. So 1 cup of butter, that's 2 cubes equals 1 cup. And we'll add our brown sugar, and vanilla. These are, you know, not exactly Weight Watcher cookies. These are, you know, the full deal. These are decadent. And one of the things that I do to adapt this chocolate chip cookie recipe to high altitude is I decrease the sugar by just a tiny bit. So I'm putting in 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar and 2/3 of a cup of granulated sugar. That's all going to go in there with a teaspoon of vanilla. So we're going to get those, and then we're going to get the mixer going. So we are starting high altitude chocolate chip cookies. And I have experimented a lot with high altitude chocolate chip cookies because, you know, there's nothing better than just a rich, gooey, warm chocolate chip cookie right out of the oven. But when you make them with the regular recipe at over 5,000 feet, they just don't turn out the same. So I've adapted them. So we are creaming together 1 cup of softened butter. Here's a change from the regular recipe. 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar, 2/3 of a cup of granulated sugar, and a teaspoon of vanilla. And we're gonna let that mixer go to work. So we're creaming together our butter, sugars, and vanilla. We're letting that whip some air into that. And we're ready for the eggs. We're gonna add 2 eggs. I hope I'm not talking too loud because I'm trying to talk over the blender, but I am mic'd, so that might be, turn your volume down if I'm blowing you away. We're gonna do 1 egg at a time. Just let that softly mix that egg in and get that going. Let me turn this. The old tried and true KitchenAid. I've gone through one of these already. This is my second one. My Montana Rancher bought me this one for Christmas a couple years ago when I blew up my old one. Burnt the motor right out of it. Here's another egg. So we're up to 2 eggs. And why this mixes, we're going to combine our dry ingredients. So here is one of the secret sauces. I have upped the flour by just a smidge. So we have 2.5 cups of flour for a regular chocolate chip cookie recipe. 2.5 cups. I'm going to add in a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda. And while this is mixing, I'm going to kind of toss this together to get those dry ingredients mixed up. Now, when I'm in a hurry, I don't always do this step. I sometimes just throw them in there. but I don't want to work that baking soda and activate the recipe too early. So I'm going to go slow with this. And here's another secret sauce. As I add the flour slowly, I think I have to turn this down. I'm going to get flour all over. Let's do a little bit of that. I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of water with the flour. It's going to help that recipe work out to high altitude the correct way. Make sure I got that all in there. That's about a third of the flour in so far. We'll let that start mixing in before we do the next set. We are adapting the world famous chocolate chip cookie recipe to high altitude. Some of these tricks that I'm going to show you work with any recipe, but in particular, chocolate chip cookies are just not the same if you don't adapt the recipes to high altitude. I live over 5,000 feet, and I like a soft cookie. I don't like a crispy cookie, and I don't want it to be smeared out all over the place when I bake them. And that's what happens if you don't adapt your recipes to high altitude, is they just spread out into a flat, crispy cookie. Not my favorite. Some of you like the flat, crispy cookies, then no need to adapt the recipe. But I like the soft, fluffy ones, and so I've experimented with chocolate chip cookies enough to get this recipe down right. We got almost the end of our flour. We'll go back and review the recipe. I always check to make sure that I got everything in before I finish, especially when I have little hands helping me in the kitchen. It's amazing how you always follow a recipe and you have little hands helping you, and all of a sudden, you know, you forget a major ingredient like eggs because you've got all the helpers helping you out. Okay, so we've got almost everything in there besides the chocolate chips. Let's go back over the recipe and check that we did everything right. I started out with a cup of butter, 2/3 of a cup of brown sugar, 2/3 of a cup of granulated sugar, and a teaspoon of vanilla. And I let that cream and really fluff it up in that blender. I followed that with 2 eggs. I added those eggs one at a time. And then I did my dry ingredients. I did a little bit switcheroo here for high altitude. I upped the flour to 2.5 cups. And then I did a teaspoon of baking soda and a teaspoon of salt. I mixed those together and added those in 3 small increments. While I was adding those, I snuck in 2 teaspoons of water. And that's going to help this recipe adapt to high altitude. And so everything's in there. I'm going to add some chocolate chips. Now, you can do however many chocolate chips you want. The recipe calls for 1.5 cups. That's chocolate chip overload for my kids. They don't like as many. They like the regular part of the cookie. So I usually stick around 1 cup. But you know, you could do M&Ms. You could do holiday M&Ms coming up for a holiday. You can do really whatever you would like. Walnuts. My husband is not a fan of finding hidden nuts in recipes. So if I'm going to cook a recipe for cookies for him, I've got to chop them up so fine that he can't find them. But we're not doing that today. We're just doing regular chocolate chip cookies. Okay, so we've got that done. And I'm going to show you guys. Let me get this. And you know, the hardest part is not eating out of the bowl. I know you're not supposed to eat raw cookie dough, but show me somebody that can resist that. If my kids were here, they would just be all over that. So I've got a chocolate chip cookie recipe all ready to go. This is the secret sauce. It doesn't matter what cookie recipe you're making at high altitude. If you just scoop those cookies right on a tray, right off the mixer, they're going to lose all their shape and spread out and be flat and be crispy. If you want them to hold their shape and be more like a cookie baked at a regular altitude, you've got to chill this dough. And when I mean chill, I like to take it almost to frozen just so I can barely scoop it out. So I never scoop these cookies right on the tray at high altitude. You're just asking for it not to turn out. So I'm going to take this cookie dough and I'm going to throw it in the freezer for half an hour. I like it almost so hard I can't scoop it out. You can chill it in the refrigerator if you've got time and you don't have kids breathing down your neck asking when the cookies are going to be done. But so I'm going to throw this in my freezer. 20 minutes usually is plenty to get those cookies cold. And when I'm talking cold, I'm talking barely able to scoop the dough out of the bowl. It's the secret sauce to high altitude. You can take a regular cookie recipe that you make. If you get that dough cold enough, they won't spread out and lose their shape when you're baking over 5,000 feet. It makes a huge difference. So I've got some dough that I chilled earlier and a cookie scoop. I made one set already, and I'll show you those as we get going. And I typically use, I love these non-stick Silpat type mats. And depending on who is coming in for lunch, I use either a really small scoop, or if the kids, I tend to use this little tiny one. And I'm just gonna scoop, and this dough is so cold, the high altitude seeker sauce, that I can barely get the scooper through it. The colder, the better. And you can really, without any adjustment to your cookie recipe, if you get that dough cold enough, it's gonna hold the shape, and it's not gonna spread out and be a flat, crispy cookie, which is not my favorite. I like soft cookies with some shape to them, and it is not an easy thing to do at high altitude. That and boiling eggs and custard. Boy, it's a learning curve when you live over 5,000 feet. So we've got cookies laid out with a scoop. I love to use a scoop, just it's faster, especially if the kids are helping me, because otherwise they'll eat more than they actually get in the oven. But these are ready to go. Now I do an oven with my typical world famous chocolate chip cookie recipe at 375. Now you can adjust that oven based on how high altitude and cook them a little bit slower just a little bit lower temp, maybe 350, and watch that first set and see where the seeker sauce is for your altitude. Because when you get over 5,000 feet, you might be at 6,500 feet, you're gonna have to adjust a little bit on your cooking temperature. So I've got the regular temperature 375, and I've got this down to a science 8 minutes. And these are out of the oven, high altitude adjusted chocolate chip cookies. They are soft and gooey. They didn't spread out too much. They freeze great, which is what I'm going to do to them, because if I leave these out, the ranch crew will eat them in one sitting. And so I like to hide them when they're not here, so I have some left over for treats. So I'll leave some out and tell them that's the end of it, and then I'll freeze some so we have a surprise coming up. But these are high altitude adjusted chocolate chip cookies, and they just come out great. The secret sauce is really in chilling the dough. If you can get that dough cold enough, most of my cookie recipes work just fine without any adjustment. Just with getting that dough absolutely as cold as you can before you bake the cookie, and getting them on don't put them on the tray and let them, get ahead of yourself with cookies in the oven and let them get kind of melty. They'll lose all that soft fluffiness as the dough gets warmer with a hot tray. So I try not to scoop them on there till they're ready to go in the oven. So I put a really cold dough into the oven so it keeps its shape and keeps that soft chocolate chip cookie shape and texture that I love, and they're not all spread out and crispy, which is what happens to cookie dough at high altitude if you don't adjust. This is a decadent chocolate chip cookie recipe. It just has a few little tweaks for high altitude, and the biggest of which is chilling that dough till it's almost frozen before you put the cookies in the oven. So that's what's happening here at the ranch. I've got a whole nother set of the dough that we just made to bake. Thanks for joining us. I'm Susie Felton. This is Mrs. Montana Rancher. If you know somebody that lives at high altitude that would enjoy this recipe and the adjustments to it, feel free to share it or tag them in the post below. It'll always be accessible, like I said, on Mrs. Montana Rancher TV over on YouTube, and from my blog. You can pin it at mrsmontanarancher.com. Thanks for joining us.